Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Tom from Data Protection World Forum, and the topic for today's webinar is Stopping Email Data Breaches, a reality for today or a task for tomorrow. And presenting today's webinar, who you should see on screen, we have Steve Wright, who is partner at Privacy Culture, and Sudeep Venkatesh, who is Chief Product Officer at Egress. And a bit about their backgrounds. Steve is passionate about big data and all things digital, with more than 20 years experience designing, developing, managing, and delivering transformational data governance, privacy, and security programs. Steve's vast experience as a pragmatic and charismatic leader ideally places him as a trusted advisor at board level on all privacy and security related matters. Steve is also a published author, a non-executive director, and is regularly invited to speak at industry events, trade associations, and thought leadership working groups, working towards continually finding new ways to increase trust and transparency in respect of consumer services, business functions, and product vendors. And Sudeep is a noted expert on data protection, bringing 2 decades of industry and technology experience in this area. His expertise spans the protection of data in both structured and unstructured data ecosystems, with an emphasis on solving real-world business problems through encryption, authentication, and key management. He has an in-depth understanding of regulatory compliance standards, including the EU GDPR, PCI, and NYDFS, etc. Sudeep has worked on numerous data security projects with Fortune 500 firms in the US, UK, and globally. And at Egress, he works as the Chief Product Officer with responsibility for product strategy, product management, and the delivery of pre- and post-sales technical services to customers. With that introduction, I'd like to hand over to Sudeep to kick off the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Tom. And it is such a pleasure to share this virtual stage with Steve. I've spent the past couple of decades, all of my career actually, on the vendor side, making and selling software products to customers like yourselves. And it's always such a big pleasure to have from the other side, I should say, especially with someone with the experience that Steve does. So really looking forward to the next hour or so. So of course, many of you have invested in email security solutions. This is a core investment that organizations make as they're undergoing digital transformation, as they're growing their businesses as well. But what we would like to do over the next hour or so is try to take a bit of a peek into the future. So try to look at what email threats of the future would look like, and then also introduce this concept that Egress has pioneered called human layer security, about how those threats and breaches can be remediated, about how they can be prevented as well. Steve and I have agreed to keep this conversation informal and free-flowing. And then, of course, I know the audience won't be shy about asking questions either. So really look forward to getting those. So a bit of a bold claim, Steve, I'll start off with here by saying that the biggest risk to many organizations out there is one that they don't actually know about. So it's one that actually sits and resides in their own business. And after a lot of research that we've done in the industry, including actually doing freedom of information requests with the ICO here in the UK, what we're realizing is that a big majority of data breaches in an email infrastructure are happening inside one's business because of insiders. So the number that the ICO gave us is that up to 60% of breaches that are reported to them, for example, are because people are sending email to the wrong recipients. And then, Steve, we were also discussing, that you were involved in a couple of consulting projects recently where this popped up rather high on the radar as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sudeep, and thank you very much for inviting me today. It's great to be here, and it's always a pleasure to be on with ProofSec and with yourselves. I think your FOI request to the ICO is not surprising, the results, but I'm going to make a bold statement. I actually think the problem's a lot higher. And I'm talking from experience because even as early as last week, one of the organisations that I look after and DPO for, we yet again had another example of someone sending an email with the wrong recipient and the wrong attachment, or certainly the attachment wasn't for their eyes. And it caused us a bit of bluffing, to say the least. And I have to say, that's literally after only, I'm going to say, less than a month. And let's be fair, there's a lot going on at the moment, so working from home. But it's less than a month after I did training for everyone in this organisation. So even with the training, we still make mistakes. And then, right, just to show that I am not immune from such blunders, I only yesterday, live off the press, sent the wrong email to, instead of an S Wright at the said company, to Susie Wright at the same company. So even after all these years and me preaching, to many people about the dangers of emails going astray or to the wrong recipient, then unfortunately we as humans continue to make these mistakes, whether it's in haste. So I think a lot of the research that you've done is absolutely spot on. I'm not at all surprised. I'm just saying that I actually think the number's a bit higher than 60%.
Absolutely. So Egress commissioned an insider breach report earlier this year about just to look at the types of breaches that are happening within organizations, and actually didn't surprise us that about 78 to 80% of IT leaders said that employees have put company data at risk accidentally. So that's a pretty alarming number, I would say. Now, some of the examples that we know of ourselves sending misdirected emails might be innocent, might not cause data breaches, but then recently in the news, there was a local council up north in the north of England that had accidentally emailed personal information of 2,000 adopted children to the wrong recipients, which of course is just a horrible, a horrible use case. And then similarly, I was visiting a client of ours, a law firm in the south of England, who said that they did business with 4 different Richard Kings, and they were constantly sending the wrong matter numbers to the wrong Richard King. So yes, you have some very touching, I think, human stories about sending emails to the wrong people, as well as some very, very serious business implications. But the interesting stat that is not shown on the screen is that an equal number of employees thought that they had never put company information at risk maliciously. How many times do we hear that a lawyer, when they're changing jobs, they think it's completely fine to take cases or matters that they worked with firm number A to firm number B, or even software engineers, you would say, in some instances, that are taking code that they developed for a certain organization to its competitor. So I'm wondering if you've encountered things like these, Steve, where employees might just not have the awareness that they're actually causing data breaches, either accidentally or maliciously.
Yeah, I think so. The point you made there, Sudip, about the malicious one, I think, right, so we all know that the biggest danger is when either there's people know they're leaving, or there's threat of redundancy. And let's be honest, right? If ever there's a burning platform for organisations, now is that time, because we are facing unprecedented economic challenges. And, we only have to pick up the newspaper to see, the huge amounts of layoffs that are going to be made across all industries over the coming year. And that's going to cause some people to think and act in a malicious way. Now, the intent might not be to cause harm, but realistically, lots of people will start sending email to maybe their private email address, or trying to, covertly try and get another job somewhere else, and might even be tempted to take, say, a database of contacts with them and that sort of thing. So there's a real danger of that, and that will spike right now as we speak. In normal times, and who knows what that will be in a few months, but in normal times, it's mostly non-malicious, and that's my experience. You know, every organisation I've worked on, most of the investigations that I've led, it's been non-malicious. It's just people not thinking, not acting, and that is despite training. As you said there, Sadiq, you know, one of the reasons I set up Privacy Culture was because I identified with the ongoing training and awareness, and e-learning is not enough. You can't expect people to sit through 45 minutes of e-learning and then expect them never to make a mistake or to change behaviours. You have to do multiple different ways to train people and to change the culture, really. So I think you're absolutely spot on, and your analysis is, points to that this is an ongoing problem. People are the weakest link, and what else, from a technology perspective or from a platform perspective, can we do to support them in their roles to help them? So yeah, it's a big challenge. But I don't think it's more non-malicious than it is malicious.
Right, and then one very interesting data point that came out is that the higher that someone is an organization, the more likely they are to cause malicious data breaches. So the more likely they are to send even something innocent, like sending company information to a Gmail account so they could work through that information at home, or fall victim to a phishing attack, for example, as well. So director level people, the survey found, are a bigger insider threat, I should say, than more, starter or junior employees. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that as well. Yeah. And I'm sure credential accumulation would have something to do with that as well, because if someone is in a director level, then they might have collected authentication, passwords and tokens for multiple systems that they haven't relinquished yet.
Yeah, well, that was going to be one of my 2 points. The first is this accumulation of access. That when you go from department to department, you tend to accumulate the same level of access, and it just grows and grows. So therefore, you've still got access to, say, records for appraisals, or you've got access to sensitive information. I think the other thing comes from the level of responsibility as a director that you assume under that particular organisation, and with that comes greater responsibility, and therefore more trust is essentially handed across to you. And I think the other sort of consideration that's related to both of them is the fact that as a director, and I was a director at Deloitte many years ago in PwC. As a director, you are given some pretty tough targets, and you have to be responsible for people, and you have to work. And back then it was obviously very different, but you had to work at home at the weekends. And for example, PwC had a very strict policy about not allowing to use Gmail or Hotmail or whatever the account was. Yet you would find examples where senior directors and partners were actually using their home email address because they needed to do a piece of work, or they needed to be ready for a call that was in a different country for first thing, and the capability wasn't there. The accessibility wasn't as widespread as it is perhaps now. So I think there's less of that now, purely by the basis that we're always switched on. We're 24/7, 365 now. So everything's in the cloud. But 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that was a lot harder, and you had to VPN in and blah 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 blah. So things have got much more accessible, and with that, I think that we've let the guard down a little bit, in terms of security.
Such a great point. And also, before we look at some of the threats in the future, it's important to look back into history a little bit and also understand that threats to digital data and threats to email change every 5 to 10 years. So in the 2000s, we looked at email firewalls. We had more and more people working remote. So we started having robust authentication systems into email platforms. And then also, as people had more laptops carrying, sensitive inboxes and PSD files, we also had disk encryption technologies in case these laptops, quote unquote, walked away. And then in the last 10 years, of course, we saw spam becoming a massive problem. So I think in the middle of the last decade, it was estimated that up to 85% of all email flowing through the internet was spam. So obviously organizations put in controls for spam, malware, and also a favorite topic for both of us, I think, which is data loss prevention. So would be good to understand a few of your thoughts as well about how the email security space has changed in the past, years that you've been involved in it.
Yeah, well, I remember the giddy days of Lotus Notes, and
you can't possibly be that old, Steve.
That's very kind of you, but I do remember using that. It was partly driven by the fact I think PwC was one of the last people to migrate to Microsoft. Anyway, but I said, I kid you not, I also tell my kids often that I remembered rolling out Windows 95. And it was a big thing because suddenly we were going from this AS400 system, which was using the tab key to go across, to a mouse. So I remember even back as a young grad, helping people understand these new things called mice, which no one can understand with GUI interfaces. I think, look, let's we can reminisce here for hours, I'm sure, but it's changed dramatically, So from my point of view, what I've seen is a huge, massive dependency on email as one of the major communication tools in modern history. We will probably look back at email as being one of those really massive global phenomenons that changed the culture of how we communicate and how we work, right? And now, obviously, that's much more instant. And who knows what it will be in another 100 years. But I think what we've realized is that whilst it's also a fantastic tool, you can also, it can actually slow down productivity and innovation. And that, unfortunately, is why us, and I won't put you in this category, Sidi, but us dinosaurs who so rely on, email to do business will have to think differently and work differently. And I'm certainly, now that I have my own business, I have to work with a number of different channels and communication techniques, such as Microsoft Teams and WhatsApp, and in fact that's pretty much all it's got to so far. But text as well. So I have to then revert back to email as my modus operandi because I feel safe with email. I know that it can stand up in court. I mean, so can anything that you write down electronically. Unless you've got one of these applications that immediately delete it after 10 seconds. But essentially, what we've done as a society is we've learned to use email, and that's been an integral part of our how we now conduct business. I rely on that email. Back to your spam point, I think we did see a spike of spam, and obviously, with all these, I think I read one statistic which said over 60,000 websites sprung up since the beginning of COVID. Unfortunately, over 50% of them are malicious. So we're still seeing this as a major tool for infiltration by hackers or hacktivists or criminals, essentially trying to get into our organization and try to pose as a trusted third party or a trusted person within the organization. So it's still a major tool for us in business, and it's still a major tool for bad people who want to do bad things once they've got control of it or got access to it. And certainly for fraud, it's a big problem. But anyway, let's. I don't know if that answered your question, but certainly it's here to stay. And tomorrow it's not going to go away. Just one more point about that. Not terribly good for well, it's kind of related, but when I was at John Lewis, I instigated a email-free zone time between sort of, I think it was 9:30 to 11. So you got to come in, do your emails in the morning, which typically was 8 to 8:30, and then by 9:30, it was all self-discipline. I wasn't checking on everyone, but I would pick them up if I saw them emailing me or something, saying, hang on, it's the curfew and all that. And the reason I did that was because what I was trying to encourage is more open communication between the teams. And I found that, teams could be sat literally adjacent to one another and they weren't talking to each other. They'd rather send an email. And the problem with that is it becomes a little bit self-deprecating, because what happens is they're sort of going from a position of, well, I'm covering my backside, essentially. I'm trying to protect myself by sending it in an email, and therefore it's official. And that's the negative side of email. And I think any tools, any techniques that we could do to change that and to feel safe in the use of email is a good thing. That was my own other point.
Yeah, and you brought up some excellent points, because that lets us hone into the fact that even the use of email has changed in the past couple of decades or so. So, from the days of Lotus and also Windows 95, when I think we had Outlook Express as an email client, the way in which we use email, the way in which we interact with email has completely changed. So, for example, 70% of emails that I open for the first time are on my mobile device. I know this sounds really sad, but one of the last things that I do before I head to bed every night is check my email. And one of the first things that I do when I wake up in the morning is check my email as well. And that's the first thing. The second thing, especially in today's environment, is that there's a drive for productivity. With unfortunately many employees being furloughed, the employees that remain take on extra tasks and extra workloads as well. So with this 24/7, 365 connected culture, there's a lot of pressure on employees, and we know what that means. More pressures mean more mistakes. So that's one point. The second point is that even pre-COVID-19, I think law enforcement has identified literally dozens of phishing attacks that have happened because of COVID-19. But now we have determined attackers who are not just spamming phishing attacks, but are getting very targeted with high-value employees in different organizations with some very clever phishing attacks that unfortunately, even with a lot of training, even with a lot of simulation-based training that we do in all our businesses, some people do fall victim to. The other thing that's different from 20 years ago is just a number of regulations that global organizations have to deal with. So do our users really understand what GDPR is and what the implications on data privacy and data protection it brings? If your organization has customers in California, do you fully understand what the CCPA is? The MAS authority in Singapore has its own data privacy and data protection regulations. And so for a normal user who just wants to get stuff done, who just wants to write a case study or respond to a matter number, things become very confusing. and that's when mistakes happen. So what we're seeing out there is that the breaches of the future, which the study brought up, will be human activated. So these will be people making mistakes. These will be people maliciously exfiltrating data out of their business, and these unfortunately will be people falling victim to impersonation attacks as well. So what we're boldly predicting, I think, is that the breaches of the next 3 to 5 years in email will be human activated, will be performed because humans, us people, are not careful, or we are in too much of a rush. So just curious to get your thoughts on that as well. How do you see the world changing in terms of email threats in the next few years?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, the danger here is, your example, Sadiq, is probably quite normal. And certainly before I I'm trying to be a little bit more self-disciplined in not checking email before I go to bed, only because then I'll worry about it and then I want to respond.
Then you lose sleep over it.
Yeah, exactly. So I've learned not to look at email after sort of tea time, which is hard. The second challenge is because I found that when I responded to email at sort of 9 o'clock at night, it was far more terse than it was if it was 9 a.m. the next morning. So I've kind of learned to, sleep and actually address these things in the morning, unless, of course, you might glance over it and in the header you can see that if it's a breach, then you've got to do something right. But generally speaking, I've learned to switch off. But that's one point. I think without a shadow of a doubt, email is here to stay for the foreseeable future because of the complex geopolitical and geo-legal basis by which you rely on that for confirming this or for denying that. So a lot of it is submissible in court. So all of those different laws around the world will, and there's over 130 privacy laws globally, will all sort of recognise the fact that whatever the mechanism is for capturing information, that could be used against you. So be careful what you write. And I think that's where what we're seeing is an awful lot of people are, would do holding emails. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, can I come back to you on this tomorrow? So that might be lines. And one particular gentleman that I deal with a lot, he's constantly got, I wrote this on the move, it's in the footer. In the signature, I wrote this on the move, so please discount what I'm saying because I may have mistyped it. And that's the other problem, right? When we're responding to stuff, we are, there might be something else going on, your favorite TV programs can start, or you want to watch the depressing news at 10 o'clock, so you're rushing to get it done before, and that's where the accidents happen. And it was exactly the same with me yesterday when I accidentally copied in Susie instead of myself. So it happens to the best of us. So it's not going to go away. If anything, it's going to get a little bit worse. My hope, and this is a hope, is that with the new normal starting, we don't know what that looks like. But what we do know is that the if you like, the reliance on home working is here to stay. It's not going to go away. Yes, of course, we'll see offices start to fill back up again, but not anytime soon, I hasten to add. And also, hang on a minute, I can actually be productive. I can, I'm a bit spoiled because I have and outbuilding. But, I can actually get on with my work here. I can lock myself away, and providing the kids aren't too noisy, I can actually get things achieved. So I think the reliance on email, and therefore what this whole presentation is about is what can we do about that, because it is a big risk, is going to become really to the forefront. And that's essentially what we're saying here. That's what the whole premise of this is, without saying too much, but we're halfway through the presentation. Okay. Email is going to continue to be a major contributor, a major part of doing business now, and even more so with remote working. So it's not going to go away. And therefore, we either teach people how to use email properly, which is just ongoing training and awareness, and/or we supplement that with technology that can help reduce that risk.
Right. So the first, I think, reaction for folks, for our audience, would be, can we take existing investments that we have, say existing investments such as DLP, and use those to deal with these more modern human-activated breaches? So, for example, we would say no, right? We would say no, and I would love to get your thoughts on this, because we feel DLP technologies, older style of doing DLP technologies, where you're matching a list of credit cards with a list of permissible senders and things like that. These are too hard to manage. They're a bit of an administration nightmare, and also the fact that they can't prevent some of these more modern threats that we're seeing. I mean, how do you use DLP technologies to prevent an impersonation-based phishing attack? So just very curious to get your thoughts on this as someone who's been very involved in deploying DLP technologies for some of the largest businesses in the world.
Yeah. Well, I was a big advocate of DLP. I think what I will say is that, like any technology or any tool deployment that you're using to help essentially mitigate the risk, or to to empower your staff to continue to work in an efficient, effective way without sort of opening your business or your organization up to more vulnerabilities. You have to look at what would be a defense in depth strategy, which it's the same premise as a castle with moats and, with drawbridges and all those kind of things. So my point here is not to go on about medieval history, is to talk about the fact that, DLP was a right thing for the time. I think what we are now facing is a much more complex threat or attack vector, and like the if you like the crossbow, from an archer to a crossbow, you've got to keep up and keep investing in your tools and techniques to mitigate these threats. And I don't think, based on the previous conversations that we've had, that the old rule-based DLP can offer the sort of functionality that's needed now to deal with these very sophisticated and complicated phishing attacks. And I think so all I'm saying is that's got to be considered in, and all CISOs and data protection officers, and I know some brilliant ones, far better than me, that will always constantly be looking to better themselves and push the boundaries of what their defenses are, of that defense in depth. They're always constantly looking at that strategy, thinking, is that good enough now? Does it cover off this specific threat? And I think that's why it's really important as a DPO and a CISO to constantly learn about what attacks are happening and how these attacks are being exploited. And you can do that through, as you suggested, through various reports that keep coming out, and some really good reports that are coming out, but also to look at the law and look at the breach enforcement actions. So, I track there's an enforcement tracker by one of the law firms. There's lots of different ways, but you've got to understand what's causing these issues, and then constantly be scratching your head thinking, am I doing enough? Is this good enough to defend us?
Right. So what Egress pioneered and what we brought to the market is that next generation from what we call static DLP. And the concept that's behind this is called human layer security, because what we believe is that to catch these modern day breaches, you first have to deeply understand human behavior. And then based on that human behavior and based on the roles that different people have in their organizations, build models of how they would behave under normal circumstances. And then if there are any deviations from that behavior, if there are any anomalies there, then essentially catch those, because those are more of these human activated breaches. So for example, if I wanted to look at a mistake that someone made in an email by copying the wrong person for a sensitive spreadsheet. By definition, I can't catch a mistake unless I know what past behavior is. The very definition for mistake is that you've deviated significantly from past behavior. So what we believe is that these more modern technologies give us vendors a lot of scope to deeply understand human behavior, build different models around understanding what normality is, and then hopefully fix breaches even before they happen. And some of these technologies include cloud and parallel processing, because if I'm looking at your previous behavior, Steve, and of the behavior of 10,000 of your colleagues, then certainly that takes a lot of compute, probably in the cloud, to form those analytical models. Similarly, now there are technologies like graph databases, which is very similar to what people like Facebook and LinkedIn use. Because whenever you log into Facebook, you see that the most relevant news feed for you pops up in the very top because of how graph databases work and because of how cliques work. And then also there are some, I know machine learning is the most overused phrase in technology, especially in security software technology right now. But there is a role that machine learning can play here as well by automatically understanding what your past behavior was and then making sure that when there are mistakes, when you're possibly falling victim to a phishing attack or in breach of a certain law, data privacy law, that we can actually stop that in its tracks. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that there have been so many advancements in cloud technologies and computing technologies and different algorithms and data analytics in the past few years as well, that now we can actually have technical controls to catch these more human-activated breaches. So wondering if you had any thoughts there, Steve.
Well, I think it's interesting because we all know that the whole challenge that we've got, current challenge that we're facing, the crisis that we're facing from this COVID, this horrible disease that's running rampant around the world, is the fact that we have to try and model the behaviours and essentially track what people are doing, because with that intelligence we can learn about people they've come in contact with and so on and so forth. And without sort of disappearing down this rabbit hole, my point is we need to be doing more modelling based behaviours to understand what people do and why they do it and when they do it. What are the sort of stress factors which we touched on earlier? Is it late at night when you're sending emails, or is it, just absent-mindedness, or or how much of this is actually malicious versus just stupidity, and therefore, can you get annoyed with people if they're constantly doing it if you haven't trained them or put in any tools to help mitigate that? So I think your point here is that we have to use the tools available to us, machine learning, AI, to create those models so that we can learn from it and we can stop it or prevent it happening in the first place. If for example, we learned that your behavior is that 5 to 9 most nights, or 2 nights a week, you send an email out, or bang, 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 then the high chances are at 5 to 9, you're going to make a mistake statistically on one of those emails. You're going to send it to the wrong person, or you're going to inflame someone. And therefore, the tools, the technology can identify that trend and can actually work in a proactive way, and that's the key for me. And certainly, I share this sentiment with lots of CISOs and DPOs. What can we do that's more preventative to stop it happening in the first place? What things can we do to try and help us understand it? And if Egress tool can do that, then that is, that's pretty darn good in my mind.
So from a tooling perspective, what exact applications can we look at? The first one is, prevention, which is if you can understand historical behavior, then you could certainly minimize or even completely eliminate the risk of accidental or even, emails sent through bad intention. But the other point that's also important, and I wanted to get your thoughts, is you could also make the protection of emails better by applying encryption and by making authentication better when you're encrypting emails. So when you worked, for example, with DLP deployments in the past, how many of them used email encryption as a remediation when you're sharing sensitive data? Would be quite keen to get your thoughts as well, because encryption always has a bad rep. It's difficult to use. People find it hard to authenticate. It's always with difficulty that people deploy encryption, email encryption.
Well, I would say we did deploy email encryption, but they were tending to be the organizations where the risk was highest. So I'm talking about financial banking sectors specifically, really, and the need for that encryption and the infrastructure, the certificate infrastructure that's sat behind it was, the business case was there, you had to do it. But I would say, in some of the deployments where that wasn't, and it's important for law firms for non-repudiation purposes, obviously. But, where I would say most of the sort of just, I'm not saying run of the mill, but most of the other organisations that weren't in those specific sectors or weren't heavily regulated, I should say, they tended to be a little bit more, how should we say, driven by the cost. And for the financial services sectors and banking and capital markets, etc., there was no consideration. They had to do it. It was, and similarly, where I was working on PCI, the payment card industry standard. So sort of some of those specific areas in commercial terms where you knew you needed to have all of that encrypted end to end.
Understood. So I know we've got about 15 minutes left. I'll quickly cover a few use cases of customers who've deployed these technologies, and then perhaps we can hand it over to Tom for a few minutes of Q&A as well. So the first customer that comes to mind is a health insurance provider, a global health insurance provider, certainly headquartered in the US, but with offices in the UK and globally as well. And what they found out, because the biggest problem with misdirected emails is that it's a hidden problem. Organizations, CISOs, don't normally quantify how many misdirected emails their businesses send and how much it's cost them from a remediation perspective. But this organization did do so. So they figured out that over 500 misdirected emails, by misdirected emails, I mean misdirected emails that had sensitive content that had to be reported to the ICO, were sent from their business in 2018, and that cost them about 60 hours of remediation per email. So this included, filing appropriate reports. This included doing investigations in emails. This included, filing the necessary paperwork and possibly paying fines from the ICO. This may also have included contacting the wrong recipients and requesting them to delete the said emails. So huge cost in terms of fines and in terms of manpower as well to remediate this. So when they deployed the Egress technology, essentially they saw that the number of misdirected emails went down by about 91% because the Egress software can really look into email bodies, email attachments, look at the to and from fields, and then make very educated guesses about whether an email was sent to the wrong person or not. Similarly, more of an insider breach is that of ethical walls, as we call them. So in the case of ethical walls, this organization wanted to be sure that their employees from the trading desk were not discussing sensitive trades and stock information with their employees from the research desk. So again, there are some very clever ways in which you can build ethical walls to prevent internal people from collaborating on certain restricted conversations and thus leading to data breaches. So that's a very important use case about a bank as well. And this is not just to do with global banks, but there are also many medium-sized law firms, insurance businesses that are required to not share one client information with the other. So, for example, if lawyers are working on Bank One and then an accounts for Bank Two as well, it's very important that that data doesn't get mixed up and that ethical walls not get breached there. So that can be enforced very cleverly now with software as well. And this is the example that I came up with before, which is the partner at this, I would say, 100 lawyer law firm down near Southampton that was talking to 4 different Richard Kings and was constantly sending documents with the wrong matter number to the wrong Richard King, thus leading to data breaches. So again, these lawyers are high pressured, they're very productive, they're responding to emails from their mobile devices constantly, they're using tools like Outlook Web Access from their home machines as well. So they needed a comprehensive solution that could prevent data breaches across all these different platforms. Hence, they invested in the Egress solution there. So just 3 very different use cases about enforcing ethical walls, as well as stopping what we see as the largest data breach reported to the regulatory authorities right now, which is misdirected emails. So I'll just give a quick call to action, Tom, and then we'll hand it back to you, and hopefully we'll take some questions from the audience as well. Number one is, if you can't measure the risk of misdirected emails and human-activated breaches in your business, then how can you actually invest and put solutions in it? So the first one is, there are tools that Egress provides with its Investigate platform as well, where you can actually very accurately measure the risk of sending misdirected emails, for example. And then, of course, there are a number of next-generation technologies that can help you fix breaches, data analytics, understanding historical behavior of these emails as well. And then the third is, these next generation technologies like Egress are not going to replace your Office 365. They're not going to replace your edge-based solutions such as a Proofpoint or a Mimecast. So you will have to think more about overlaying these solutions on your existing Office 365, on your existing Mimecast deployments, where these solutions probably catch 80-85% of breaches out there. But some of those more clever human-activated breaches, for that you would need a more specialized technology that uses something like human layer security. So with that, Tom, I'll hand it back to you, and let's see if we can take some questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you, Sudeep. Thanks for that presentation, guys. Thought that ran really smoothly. We've got a few questions here, and to our audience, please do leave those in the Q&A box if you've got anything you'd like to ask now. First question from Molly. What proportion of the emails with wrong recipients do you believe are malicious versus human error? Perhaps one for you, Sudeep.
Yes, and Steve actually had some thoughts on this as well, so I'll request him for his comments. But I do believe that human error or misdirected emails or accidental send are the vast majority of these, because every one of your employees emails to the wrong recipient, but it's only a small, minute percentage of your employees that are maliciously send information out either to competitors or innocently sending it out, but on purpose to their Gmail account so they could work on certain accounts from home. So I believe accidental sends vastly overshadow the malicious sends in an organization.
Yeah, I would second that. In my experience, the malicious is 5% or less. If you like, the accidental and the non-malicious is pretty much 60 to 70% of what's going wrong in terms of total breaches, not just to do with email. So yeah, I would agree with Sudhi on those numbers.
Okay, and another here from Christina, who says, encryption is a good security measure for data at rest and in transit. Therefore, data in use is not protected by encryption. How far has pseudonymization been implemented in the way of working of organizations?
So I think that's a good point. Pseudonymization is a good technology when that data normally stays inside your business. So suppose you have sensitive information in backend Oracle databases or Hadoop platforms or mainframe systems, and that data is used and processed within your organization, then pseudonymization, of course, is a great solution there. Pseudonymization won't work for email encryption because with emails, these emails have to be sent outside your business. So they have to be shared with partners, with customers, with patients, etc. So in that case, message level encryption, which is what most email encryption technologies give you, is what is needed. Otherwise, it's very difficult from a software perspective, from a key management perspective, to push out your pseudonymization strategy outside your business. So any sort of structured data sitting in backend databases, pseudonymization is the way to go. But any unstructured data, such as emails and files, especially those that have to be shared outside your business, you would need some sort of an email encryption strategy out there. So I think a good question from Kate over there. So Kate, we're absolutely not advocating that all misdirected email breaches be reported to the ICO. Of course, it's up to the security team to investigate them, and only in certain cases when sensitive data has been breached should they be reported. So of course, that's not what we're recommending. So I think a good question came from Claudia as well, where I think, Tom, I can go on if you don't mind.
Of course, please do.
Yeah. So Claudia's got a good question about, if you have sensitive info, but it's an organization with a modest budget, how do you stop them sending emails accidentally? Example to a foster carer with a similar name, or to a social worker with a similar name who gets copied in by accident. So it's not a matter of ring fencing the individuals there, Claudia. It's more a matter of, understanding what sort of data has been communicated to what individual in the past, and then picking up when that's a difference. So for example, I may be communicating national insurance numbers or health records with a certain company A or with certain individuals in that business. But now suddenly if I'm taking that same sensitive data and I've copied other people in that email with different domains that I don't normally share that data with, then that's, of course, something that the software can pick up. And from an infrastructure perspective, these software technologies don't have to deploy a lot, especially in our case. So a lot of the processing happens in the cloud, while almost customers have to deploy is just a little plugin into Outlook that can look at historical behavior and then alert you when you're making mistakes. So I really don't think there's a big investment that people have to make in terms of infrastructure for deploying these solutions.
Am I back on, or did you lose me?
You're back now, Steve, so we can hear you loud and clear.
I don't know what happened there. Technology, huh?
Technology.
Steve, would you mind just reiterating your answer to the question from Wendy, please? Unfortunately, we missed all of it.
Oh, no. Okay. How annoying. Sorry. I was just saying that my example when I was at PwC is you had 3 strikes and you were out. So irrespective of the circumstances, there's a level of responsibility and care that you as an employee need to take. But when it's all dependent on the culture of the organisation. You know, there's organisations that I support now that they wouldn't dream of saying such a thing. You know, it's just not that way inclined. So it depends on the sensitivity of the data. So you might have different levels of kind of disciplinary against the category of data. So if it's obviously extremely confidential, it's share price information, then that could quickly lead to a written warning. You might skip the first, verbal warning, but anyway, it's a big HRE type and cultural question. And Tom, if can you still hear me? I'm not sure.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say just a little word on about breaches, just generally, because coming from a DPO and a CISO background, I've had to wear both hats at John Lewis. And look, breaches happen. They happen all the time. We used to call it our white noise. It got to a point where I was on the phone to the ICO on a weekly basis explaining what happened this week. So that's an extreme. The ICO have had 18,500 breaches, reported to them. They're basically snowed under, dealing with all of those breaches. I'm not advocating that you don't report it. I'm just saying that it's a responsibility to look at the harm that's caused by that breach and then do an evaluation and then make a decision as your DPO or with your DPO as to whether or not you notify. Obviously for sensitive data that's different, but generally speaking, it's all down to who's been impacted, how many people have been impacted by this incident, which is typically email, and how you contained it, and how quickly you resolved it, and all those kind of things come into bear. But the fundamental question when any of these breaches occur is, what's the harm to the individual? Have you infringed on their rights and freedoms as an individual? And that's when you have to make that difficult choice as to whether you report or not report. I will only say one other thing, and that is, look, if you're concerned, then report to the ICO, because they are actually very friendly, and you can contact them and say, we've had this has happened, it's this type of data, and they will, they can't give you advice, but they will say, look, that does feel like it's you've done as much as you can, but what's the harm? Have you done an assessment to look at the impact? The harm impact table is something that every DPO should have to hand. So sorry, I just wanted to qualify that. Sorry, Sadiq, back to you, Tom.
That's perfect. Thank you for that, Steve. And I think that answers the other question we have here from Jacob, which is a standard including sensitive data sent to a wrong recipient a notifiable breach to a data protection authority?
Yeah, it just depends. And I swore I'd never say that word because I'm not a lawyer. But it does just depend. I'm sorry, I can't give you a straight yay or nay because it goes back to that impact. So let's try and get through some of the other questions because I'm conscious that
we're almost out of time. Yeah.
So final question here from Claudia, who says, it is hard to balance disciplinary with keeping an open culture. Do you agree? I don't favour too much of a disciplinary culture, as I'm concerned that if I tell clients to do that with their employees, they're more likely to hide their mistakes.
Yes, it's a big challenge, isn't it?
It's a balancing act. I completely agree. But the healthcare organization that I spoke about before, they're one of the few organizations that I've heard of that have put in disciplinary action for employees sending misdirected emails out. So for employees having accidents with accidental sends of emails. So I think it's a balance that everyone has to do based on what sort of data they're handling and based on the impact of these breaches to their business as well.
Okay, and with that, our hour is up. And so I'd like to thank Steve and Sadiq for your time, for that presentation, informative, and for your answers to the audience questions there. Thank you to our audience for joining us, and we hope to speak to you again soon.